Okay, Erev Tov, Shavua Tov, Chodesh Tov. It is Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and Ezrat Hashem, the month is going to be a great month with all kinds of nisim and niflaot, Ezrat Hashem. And refuah shlema to everybody who needs one. Tov, I want to do tonight is spend a little bit more time, a little bit talking about general information about this chapter, which is Perek Bet in Ezra, which again is mostly dealing with names, but he has a lot of interesting little tidbits along the way, which we'll discuss some of them tonight. So we'll talk a little bit about more background on this chapter, an overview, and mention a couple of questions. Then we're going to look at a few psukim and discuss a couple of items that come up in those psukim. So let's just go back a little bit and review some information we talked about, most of which right now I've not talked about before. It has to do with this entire listing of people. And it's not just names. We will see that also there is some semblance of an order. I mentioned last week that it didn't seem like there was an order because maybe they're kind of just scribes are writing the names down as people are leaving the country, and therefore there's not necessarily complete order. But Begadol, we could say that it talks about various Yisraelim leaving in the first approximately 30 psukim. Then it talks about the Levi'im, including the singers, those who sang in the Beit HaMikdash, those who were the gatekeepers of the Beit HaMikdash, they or their families, which we'll be discussing at a later date. Then we'll talk about various people who worked in the Beit HaMikdash, including also, it mentions, interestingly enough, the Netinim, or the Natin. Netinim were those people in the time of Yehoshua who converted, and it would seem that because they are still a factor, their names are being brought up, and we'll see that not tonight, maybe next week, that they had completely and fully integrated into Jewish society, into the Jewish community. Also, there were servants of Shlomo, or his descendants, or their descendants that are going to be mentioned in this chapter. But we also will find out that there'll be a number of families who were unable to establish their genealogy. I'm not saying that they can't establish necessarily they were Jewish, although there were some, but even they could not establish for sure if they were Kohanim or Levi'im. The important reason that that's being mentioned, of course, is we have to remember what's the end game here. What is it they're going to do? They're going to be going to Aliyah to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. They're not just stam going on Aliyah. So it's important to know who was a Kohen, who was a Levi. But if there were those who could not establish their kahuna, their priesthood, so to speak, of their past, so the governor, which was a topic or a title which we'll discuss at a later time, the Tirshata, decided that until the Urim V'Tumim can be reestablished and decide who really was a Kohen, so unless they were able to prove their kahuna status, they could not participate in bringing korbanot, eating korbanot. In addition to the names of families and certain individuals, we also see there will be a listing of the servants, of livestock, of animals. It tells us also near the end that and this was the original intent of Koresh, that many of the leaders joined together to contribute gold and silver and other items that would be then brought to be used in the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, and also for the actual ability to sustain the families who were on this journey. So the question, like I guess we sort of discussed briefly last week, is what is that we're supposed to make of this list? What's its purpose? Well, we know we discussed part of the purpose and significance because it's somewhat of an honor roll. But also, I think it's a good snapshot of what was going on at that time period. You know, we tend to think of in terms of the lens of today, that people with their North America or England, they can sign up through Nefesh B'Nefesh, and within a matter of X amount of months, and or maybe less, depending on the situation, and having had their interviews with a representative of the Jewish agency, they come to Israel, and we have the law of what we call the law of return. So a Jew basically has a right to come to Israel to settle in the land, and there's no rhyme or reason. Someone wants to come from Peatone, Illinois, and someone wants to come from Manchester. They're welcome with open arms, hopefully. Here we have a mixed bag. I mentioned to you that we have people can't necessarily prove the genealogy. We're going to see that there's a kind of like a catch-all pasuk that says, well, okay, there were these other guys too. There was this, let's say, a struggle, some kind of a struggle. I don't mean a physical struggle, just a communal struggle, a identity struggle. And there are tensions that run throughout this particular parak. We'll see as we go through it. Like I said, 70 psukim will not be spending a lot of time on every pasuk, but certain ones we will. And b'sach hakol, after 70 years after destruction, the fact that this people who had been relatively good shape settled into a different country is miraculous that they're returning. And I don't want to make the comparison to post-World War II and all of that. We're just talking right now in very general terms. Yet, with all this, the gates opening and everything else, still we talked about this, that less than 50,000 people return in this particular first wave of Aliyah, many of whom were lacking the means to do that. They left their community behind. They were undermanned. They were lacking resources, because we don't only have to take into account just the people that left and are going to Israel and what they're going to do on that end. We also have to think of the other side, what's being left behind. So there were problems back home in the old country, in their old country where they were at. And it also gives us a good indication that it was Jews of all different stripes that came back to Israel. If you're to ask the average person who is not familiar with Sefer Ezra, but just knows in general that it's a story of the Jews coming back of Shivat Zion, most people would say that, that we'll use modern terms, the Dati Jews returned and they rebuilt the Beit HaMikdash. And that would be completely wrong, because it's very far from that. First, they didn't just return and immediately build the Beit HaMikdash, as we've talked about. They will run into all kinds of problems. In addition to that, it was all, as we see, it wasn't just the top tier, it wasn't just the Dati, it was a whole range of people. But the really surprising piece is the very, very, very low number of Levi'im that make Aliyah. Now, the fact that you're going to rebuild Beit HaMikdash, you would need at least two major groups of people in the aftermath of that rebuilt Beit HaMikdash would be Kohanim and Levi'im. But the Levi'im numbered in Bavel, before anyone left, almost 43,000 Levi'im. And out of 43,000 Levi'im, only 341, according to the text, made Aliyah.
Where do we know the total from? Where do we know 43,000 from? From
another place, from later in Sefer Ezra and then in Nehemiah, from other counts. And then we have another situation. I said you have many could not prove their kahuna. The listing is going to show us 652. 652 that cannot prove their Jewishness even. We weren't sure 100% they were Jewish. And many of the Kohanim that couldn't prove that they were Kohanim, which is a number that it's not in there. The crazy thing is that there were nearly twice as many people who were unable to prove their Jewishness than there were Levi'im that went on Aliyah. Now, why is the number small from the Levi'im? It's something we'll hopefully still discuss this evening. The time period, like we say, that there are different waves of Aliyah. There was the time period now, there's in Perek Chet, in Ezra, we'll see in Zion Chet, we'll have another wave of Aliyah, and then again, Sefer Nehemiah, there'll be a wave of Aliyah. So this is not just a one-off that people going, they're going to build Beit HaMikdash and Shalom Yisrael, far from that. There were also other challenges they had. Among them was intermarriage. We think that nowadays we do, and we have a horrible problem of intermarriage. In some cities in the United States, it's over 75% rate of intermarriage. There was also mass ignorance. Now, what do I mean by mass ignorance? Nowadays, if you have even some semblance of knowledge of Judaism and you want to learn, and you speak most of the common world languages, whether it's English, French, German, Spanish, you can, and Korean, by the way, if you're talking about the Talmud, you can find classes and texts up to your eyeballs, because you can become educated. There is no reason other than certain people's circumstances may dictate it, that a person cannot get a Jewish education somehow, no matter what their age, no matter what their status. In that time, there were all kinds of problems with education. There were people who had zero knowledge and did not know an aleph from a bet from anything else. And at the same time, you also had a community trying to establish religious, I guess, what do you call them, bona fides? And like, they are religious, and this is what they do, and this is how we're supposed to act. So there is a sense of both triumph. They're going to be going to Israel. There's reticence, there's anxiety, there's uneasiness, there's a kind of this whole big mix of being unsure. So all these things combined make for a very interesting series of events or psukim that we're going to come across. And let's take a look now. Let's take a look starting at pasuk Gimel. Now, some of these I'm just going to read through because we need to read them, just give them their honor for having been gone on Aliyah in this first wave. And then when we get to Pasuk Kaf Aleph, we're going to start going slow, a little bit slower because they have a few psukim that we're going to talk about. So again, we're going to start in Pasuk Gimel, which is where we left off last week. Bnei Parosh 2,172. Again, these are basically names of families or descendants of families, and the amount of people. I'm not going to even translate. They're just their numbers right now of the people, the families. Bnei Shefatia 372. Bnei Orach 750. Bnei Pachat Moav Livnei Yeshua Yoav 2,812. Now, I will tell you that in Pasuk Vav, you come across the word Bnei Pachat Moav. We will come across the term Pecha, Pechet He, which is originally, if I looked it up, is originally Akkadian, that made its way to Aramaic, which made its way into Hebrew. We're going to use the term governor very loosely to explain what that is, but we're going to come back to that. Just mentioning it, I think it's the first time it's mentioning it so far. We'll talk about that title later on. Bnei Elam 1,254, Bnei Zatush 945, Bnei Zakai 760, Bnei Bani 642, Bnei Bevai 623, Bnei Azgad 1,222. One of the things you can pick up from here, when you hear some of these names, and especially look at the next pasuk, Bnei Adonikam 666, that many of these families started to take on Loazi names, names that are not Hebrew per se. Give you an example. We look at the names Mordechai and Esther as being Hebrew names. They are, but they're not originally. It comes from Morduch and Ishtar. So they're not originally of Hebrew origin. They became. So just like you may hear a last name today, that you can have a Jewish family whose last name is Brown, for example, it doesn't mean it was a Hebrew name. That's not a Hebrew name per se, but it took on an outside Hebrew name. So too, they were taking on Babylonian family names as well. Even though I'm not going to get into names right now, because really Hebrew family names names of families don't really start as far as the world is concerned until the Middle Ages.
For many years, the president of the Belfast Hebrew congregation was a man called Harold Smith.
You can't get more generic than that, right?
Captain Harold Smith.
Captain Harold Smith. Interesting. Yeah, the president of the vice president of the place I got in smicha from, his name is Rabbi Harold P. Smith. So yeah, and he's actually signed my one of the signatures on my smicha.
Weird.
Yeah,
that is
Harold
weird.
P. Yeah, and he was a brilliant orator as well. So okay, so pasuk Yud Daled. Bnei Bigvai 2,056, Bnei Adin 454. Bnei Ater Lechizkiah 98, Bnei Veitzai 323, Bnei Yorah 112, Bnei Cheshum 223, Bnei Gibar 95. Okay, so here you have these first series of psukim. You have family names. You have the numbers of the people that went on Aliyah. Let's take a look now at pasuk Kaf Aleph. I'm going to read it to you. And we're going to see a change. If you take a look at actually just look at the first couple of words in pasuk kaf aleph, kaf bet, kaf gimel, kaf dalet, kaf. It's the next few psukim. It starts with b'nei beit, right? Or sorry, no, back up a second. Hold on, I have a note here. I meant to say, but I'm about to say really applies starting with with this pasuk. B'nei beit, with the exception of kaf gimel, it says anshe, and a couple others says anshe. Most of the next few psukim say b'nei something. B'nei Beit Lechem mea esrim u'shlosha. It says the people, the families, or the children of Beit Lechem, 123. So now instead of having families, it starts talking now about communities. The first one being Beit Lechem. There's no, in this particular list, there are no names on this section. It has names of communities. Later on in Ezra and also Nehemiah, when it lists this area, it has another census, and either it's a review or it's a new wave. It doesn't do any of these communities. There's a list of 14 groups, 14 different communities. And here we see that Beit Lechem is called B'nei Beit Lechem, and in Nehemiah, when it does refer to them, it calls them Anshe Beit Lechem. What's the difference? Why is there that change between Sefer Ezra and Sefer Nehemiah when there is a recalling of this first wave of Aliyah? Why does it change from B'nei Beit Lechem to Anshe Beit Lechem? So at this point, these are we talked about last week. If you look at Pasuk Bet, I think it was. Let's see. No, Pasuk Aleph. Sorry, look back to Pasuk Aleph. These are the names of the people, the country who went back from captivity in the Golah. We spent some time last week talking about this, that some who were from Yerushalayim area went back there. We said that the second half of the Pasuk meant that people who came from other cities went back to then settle back in their original homeland. Their homestead, whatever, their cities. So now come back to Pasuk Kaf Aleph. It says B'nei Beit Lechem. Why? Because these are families whose roots were in the city of Beit Lechem. Later on in Nehemiah, he talks about this very same point about these families or these people. He refers to them as Anshe Beit Lechem because they already were settled back in Beit Lechem. So as opposed to being someone who says that they are from Beit Lechem, which is in originally, my homeland was Beit Lechem, my home city. Now, when Nehemiah refers to them, he tells them because they were already settled in there. So let's take a look now at a couple more psukim. Anshe Netofa 56, the people who from the city of Netofa, there were 56 of them. Anshe Anatot 128. We're going to spend a couple minutes on this pasuk. The people of Anatot were a total of 128. What's special about Anatot? Who was from Anatot? Who was from Anatot? Sorry?
Yirmiyahu.
Yirmiyahu was from there. But anybody else? Yirmiyahu was from Anatot. Yes, I heard. Yirmiyahu. Very good. Was it Yirmiyahu by any chance? By the way, so is Nehemiah. That was his hometown. Now, why is it mentioning this over here? Why? Let's see. Let's take a look at a concept here. The people of Anatot were horribly mean to Nehemiah. They're horrible to him. And it caused a tremendous amount of animosity between Nehemiah and the people from Anatot. However, the Gemara and Midrash and a couple other places tell us, actually it's Midrash, I'll tell you, I wrote it down, where Midrash Tanchuma in Parshat Balak says that based on this pasuk, we can say that the people of Anatot did tshuva, and as a result were zochim to come back, and they're identified as being from Anatot, and it was an example of what people can do to change their lives, in spite of the fact that they may have caused problems for the leaders of the community. I think that's a good lesson in humility, both directions, for leaders of communities. You talk about the machers of communities, whether, I don't mean the rabbis aren't machers, but just, whether you have the rabbi of the community, the machers of the community. Unfortunately, there are many times when they get into sichsuchim, they get into problems. And the whole goal should be if they do get into issues like that, should be shalom. And in this particular case, shalom was made, and that's one of the reasons that they specifically earned their place here, because very simply, in theory, Ezra, who probably wrote Sefer Ezra, or the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, whom Ezra and Nehemiah founded, could have left their names out. Could have had them. How could they left them out? Because they could have included them in later on. We're going to see this general pasuk that is kind of okay. And here's a bunch of other people because they couldn't identify where exactly they were originally from. They could have put them in there, but specifically the Midrash in Tanchuma, in where I write down, Parshat Balak said that they were zochim to be listed here because they made peace and apologized to Nehemiah, and therefore were able to earn their place in their position here. Let's go on to the next, read the next few psukim. Bnei Azmavet 42, Bnei Kiryat Arim Kfira Uve'erot 743, Bnei Rama Vagava 621, אנשי מכמס 122, אנשי בית אל והעי 223, בני נבו 52. Before I mention Bnei Nevo, notice in Pasuk Kavchet, people from Beit El and Ai. What was significant historically about Ai, Ayin Yud? Anyone remember? We didn't learn this in any of my past classes of Navi, because it predated
That's
those
very
classes.
odd. I was supposed to be Cherem, Tel Olam.
That was Yericho.
No, because of the Myanmar of what was his name? Achan? Who took from the Shalal?
Who took from the Shalal, right, which is Al-Kei Nekaved. That was what's written from the on the second paragraph of Aleinu. But what happened?
So the second time they attacked, they were successful.
What? Okay, who's they and what do you mean? But the first time, second time?
Sure.
Right, so the time Yoshua, the first major attack the Jews did was at Ai, and I always remember how when I taught my kids in school how to remember they lost the first try, but it was Ai, and it's a dumb way to remember.
But it wasn't the first major attack because that was Yericho.
No, that was
that wasn't an attack.
That wasn't an attack at all. That wasn't an attack. That was all orchestrated by Hashem, and the going around and the blowing the shofarot and everything. The walls come down. That's not an attack.
Right. It was a partnership. Right.
Right. They lost the first battle. The Jews lost the first battle, and for various reasons, which we'll get into, you have to learn Sefer Yoshua together. Then they won. Okay. Then in Kaftet Bnei Nevo 52, and then we just have to pause for a second and recognize Mitzvah Nevo in this one. Just stop. Okay. They didn't live in Mitzvah Nevo. Okay. Let's move on. Pasuk Lamed and Lamed Aleph. Here you have, first let me read the two psukim. Bnei Magrish 156, Bnei Elam Acher 1254. You would be hard pressed, meaning you would not be able to find the names of those two cities in Israel. You can take out a good map, a good atlas, and you won't find these two cities. And yet, you're talking about people who are returning from those cities from Bavel. So I checked into this, and besides the Dat Sofrim, others point out that these two cities were actually outside of Israel in Chutz La'aretz, but they were miyuchas to Jews that were living there, meaning there was a strong concentration. Now, how many originally, I have no idea, no one can tell you, but I can tell you it was a strong enough Jewish community that had some roots connecting it to Israel, not necessarily physically, I'm not talking physically, that they were zochim, that when they were taken to Bavel, or maybe they went to be with their fellow Jews, that I could not tell you, that when they returned, they earned a place in this honor roll as well. Next, Pasuk Lamed Bet, Bnei Charim 320, Bnei Lod Chadid ve'ono 725. By the way, there's a rule, as far as I know here in Israel, that they will only call a city a biblical name if there is some proof that it has a direct connection to that name. So, for example, the Beersheba is called Beersheba because it's next to Tel Beersheba, and that there's a continuity of knowledge to that particular location. They cannot call Ma'ale Adumim could not be called Beersheba because it's not. It has no. It's not his anyway. It's connected historically to Beersheba. So when you see some of these names and you know these names that are today, generally speaking, I cannot say 100% of the time because there's no such thing, that these are the cities that the people were from, and these are the cities that people went back to. Bnei Yericho, 345. This would beg the question, and I didn't really look into it yet, and I plan to. Is this, because as was mentioned before by Michael, that Yericho, we know you're not allowed to rebuild. So who is it that's coming back to Yericho, and why would they be allowed to rebuild it, even though we know that in the time of the kings, it does get rebuilt, and then the sons of the kings dies. For those who remember the story in Sefer Melachim, Pasuk Lamed Hey. Okay, this pasuk is was not a city. It says Bnei Sinaa Shloshet Alafim B'Sheshmot Ushloshim. There were 3,630 Bnei Sinaa. Now that was not in this case a city, but actually was a grouping of individuals. It's kind of like a miscellaneous group that they could not identify necessarily where they were from originally, who they were exactly, what their genealogy might have been. So this is your, and also, it's put here in the middle. I don't know why. I did not find a reason why it's put here in the middle. Sorry, I do know why. It's because this is the end of the listing of the different people's communities as opposed to families. And now it's going to switch in a moment to the Kohanim. But they, I want you to try and picture something. It's hard for us to do that, but let's picture people are leaving Bavel, and you have the groups as they're leaving. So you have all the families that come from Lod, and the families that came from whatever the names, Michmas, and all these other places, and they're going out. And then you have all these other people, and so the scribe is writing down. What's he supposed to write down? Well, what city are you from? I don't know. We never had any connection to a city, or I never knew where my parents were from, or my grandparents. So this conglomerate of number of whatever it was, 3,630 is left at the end of this list that started back at Pasuk Kaf Aleph until Pasuk Lamed Hey, and it ends up with, I hate using the word miscellaneous, but the other people who also went, but without any exact identifiers of who they were, what families they were coming from, and also what cities or communities they went back to. Pasuk Lamed Vav, HaKohanim. I'm going to look at a couple of slides in a minute, but the Kohanim, Bnei Yedaya, Leveit Yeshua, Tisha Meot Shivim Ushlosha. Let's take a look. Let's do a little screen share. Okay. It tells us there were 973, right? 973. Let's take a look at this slide. Hamispar hakolel shel hakohanim hayarav lemidai biyachas leolim b'sha'ah zo. The number of kohanim that came on Aliyah was larger than relative to the amount of people that went on Aliyah. As you keep reading, the first pasuk of the first family was already just 973, and you keep reading, there's more, but the total number was more than 4,000, meaning asirit min haolim. There was about 10% of those who went on Aliyah were Kohanim. In ki lo yadua haim nimnu be'oto ofen migil mesuyam. Remember, one of the things we talked about last week is when the numbers that we're talking about, were they just male adults? Were they entire families? It's really not clear. But so here he's saying that when it says over 4,000 Kohanim, you have to be talking about males because they're the Kohanim. Are they also including their families, not including their families? Hard to say. כפי שנמסר בגמרא, חולקו לאחר מכן 4 משפחות אלו למלא את העבודה של כל השנה. כאשר עלו לאחר מכן כהנים ממשפחות אחרות, צורפו למשפחות הקיימים. So these people came, these were the original Kohanim that started to serve eventually once the Beit HaMikdash was built. And then future Kohanim that came were then added and combined to these people, to these original Kohanim that came into the various mishmarot. Mishmarot were the various shifts that were taken in the Beit HaMikdash and were used, if you look at the very, very first Mishnah in Brachot, you'll understand what I'm talking about, the Mishnot of the Kohanim. We're going to come back to this slide in a minute. Okay, let's take a look at a couple. Let's read some more of the Kohanim. Continuing Pasuk Lamed Zayin. Bnei Imer 1052, Bnei Fashchud. I turn a couple pages in my book. As soon as I get there. 1247, Bnei Charim 1017. Okay, those are the Kohanim. What about the Levi'im? Levi'im, Bnei Yeshua v'Kadmiel Livnei Hodaya 74, only 74. There were 74. The Mishorerim, the singers, Bnei Asaf, 128, 128 of them. Bnei Ashoarim, the gatekeepers, Bnei Shalom, Bnei Ater, Bnei Talmon, Bnei Akuv, Bnei Chatita, Bnei Shovai, Hakol 139. So if you have 139, you have 128, and 100, and you have 74. It's very yeah. Then you take those numbers again. We said that there was only a very small percentage of the over 40,000 Levi'im that were in Bavel. So the question, of course, comes up: how is it? Why a small amount of Levi'im went? And we're going to look at a couple of things tonight that will maybe surprise you, maybe be a little lesser known pieces of information. We know that the Torah gives a whole list of jobs of the Kohanim. We know whether they are the Levi'im, whether they had to be singers or they were taking part the Mishkan. They were, of course, the Sgan LeKohen, that's the name Segel, of course. They had lots of jobs. The Gam Behorat Torah Le'am, they also were involved, like the Kohanim, in being educators. And very often it happened that they weren't necessarily supported financially the best way. Yes, giving meiser, giving tithes to the Levi'im from produce was, of course, a very honorable action. A person who separated Trumot and Masrot, it was in his right to give whomever he wanted the Truma for the Kohanim and the Maser to the Levim. What happened? It meant that the Levim did not necessarily have any sense of security that every month they were going to get whatever amount they were going to get. So that, for example, let's say I had a field and I was giving Trumot and Ma'asrot. So I'd bring my Truma to Mr. Kohen because I liked him, and I brought it to Mr. Levi because I liked him. And the next month I decided to give it to somebody else, which meant that the first Levi I gave to didn't get, right? Now the Kohanim are not only getting Trumot, they're also getting Korbanot from the Beit HaMikdash. But with the poor little Levi'im, they're really relying a lot on what the people are going to give them as tithes, as the Maser. And it was a very unstable life for them. We're talking now towards the latter part of the second Beit HaMikdash, the first Beit HaMikdash. In the beginning of the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, they came up with an idea that would maybe resolve that problem, where not all the Levim were getting their due, what they should have, because some Levim were getting more and some less. How they do it, and this is going to sound a little bit, well, I'll just let it say what it sounds like. They said to people, bring all your maaser, bring it to the Beit HaMikdash, and then it would be evenly distributed among all the Levi'im. Evidently, that did not last very long. Why? Because people started to spread out among the country in Israel. Because people were living in the Galil, the Golan, wherever they were living, and they weren't going to schlep all the way down to bring their maaser down to the Beit HaMikdash. And they didn't establish different storehouses in other locations from where to distribute the maaser. So first of all, towards the end of the first Beit HaMikdash, the Levim already knew that their matzav kalkali was a problem. Their economic status and safety and security, not safety, but security of an income, so to speak, of food was problematic. It's possible that because of that situation at the end of the Bayit Rishon, it's possible that the Levim were not in such a rush to go back to Israel because they were not assured of Parnassah. Now, I don't want it to sound like today, where people say, well, what do you mean by Kaliyah? How do I know about Parnassah? Did you even bother trying to look into it? Did you even think about looking into it? Most people will say, no, this isn't the situation. This is a serious situation where the Levi'im were they understood what happened before the end of the Bayit Rishon, that they were getting more and more families that had less and less produce being given to them. It wasn't necessarily out of spite. Like, why would I give Mr. Levi, who lives in a different city, when I have Mr. Levi nearby, and I'm going to give to him? And in that city, they maybe didn't have enough people to give. So it was an imbalance in the economic situation. So possibly that caused the Levi'im to say, I'm not rushing there so fast. It's also possible there weren't a lot of Levi'im in Bavel. Now, here's another possibility. It's also possible that the amount of Levim, even though I told you there's a number it's recorded elsewhere, that relatively speaking was still a smaller number than it could have been, because when the bad guys came, when Nebuchadnezzar's people came to the Beit HaMikdash, many Levim were still there, present and working, and they were killed while they were guarding the Beit HaMikdash. Also, many Levim were spread around the different lands, cities of the 10 Shvatim up north. The Galui Mahem Lashur, and they were sent to Assyria, or they were spread into other areas. In any case, the amount of people who made Aliyah from Shevet Levi were very small. Ezra, and the next wave of Aliyah, in the time of Ezra, a few chapters from now, they had to seek them out. As we will see in Perek Chet, and for over a period of psukim, it was necessary for Ezra to actually try to convince people from Shevet Levi to go on Aliyah. I'm not going to do that. Okay, now before we look at this slide, I want to mention something else. When you take what we just said on face value, what the Dat Sofrim says, it almost, you could say, you can make an argument for, well, wait a minute. That kind of shows a lack of emunah in the Levi'im. Maybe it's a lack of emunah, because yeah, they saw what was going on, but that was towards the end of Bayit Rishon. Now this is a new time. This is Shivat Zion, Bayit Sheni. Obviously, things have to be better, and people are going to be instructed. But we do see, in a roundabout way, an amazing, amazing act of emunah. Maybe not the right word, but we'll use it anyways. Of Shevet Levi. Let's take a look at a Tosfot in Masachet Kiddushin, dealing with the last chapter, Asar Yuchasin, which talks about the people that went up from Bavel to Israel. It talks about the fact that there were Kohanim, Levim, Yisraelim, Netinim, as we've been talking about. And in the Gemara, without context right now, just I'm going to read the sentence of the Gemara. It says, "U'mibnei Levi lo matzati sham." I found no one from Bnei Levi. Okay, again, leave the context out, because obviously there were Levi'im that went. Says the Gemara, "V'im tomar." Maybe you will say, "V'hamrina b'matnitina sara yuchasin alumi bavel v'kachashiv Levi'im." Wait a minute, why can you say that there were no Levi'im that went? Nevertheless, we know the Mishnah just told us that among those that went from Bavel were Levi'im, the Yesh Lomar. So the Tosfot answers, the Chol HaLevi'im Shalu Imo Hayu Kitzutzei Behonot, that the Levi'im that went, they were Levi'im, but they were not complete physically, because they were missing their thumbs. And they were unable to sing on the platform, on the Duchan, the Shirah. What in the world is that talking about? Maybe they're missing thumbs. What's going on? But every Levi decided they're going to get rid of their thumb. This is from Psikta Rabati. This is a midrash, and tells us this following statement. Nebuchadnezzar said, Amar lahem Nebuchadnezzar, I started the bracket early. Amar lahem Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar said to the Levi'im, Ma'atem yoshimu bochim. Why are you sitting here crying? Hu korei l'shivto shel Levi, v'amar lahem achinu atzmechem ad she'anu ochlim v'shotim. Ani mevakesh sheta'amdu v'takishu lefanai b'kinorot shelachem. He says, you know what? Everyone, stop your moaning, you're crying, you're complaining. Come here. We're going to get you guys to do something. I want you to take your harps, just like you played, just like you played in the Beit HaMikdash Shalachem of yours. Litnei Elokechem, mistaklim elu. Sorry. So he says, I want you to bring your harps. I want you to start playing for me, just like you did in the Beit HaMikdash. Mistaklim elu be'elu. All the Levim started to look at each other. Ve'amru, and they said, Lo dayenu shecharavnu beit mikdasho ba'avonotenu. It's not bad enough that Hashem, our Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, or his Beit HaMikdash was destroyed because of our sins. And we're going to now, it's bad enough that we had to run away from be taken into Galut. Bad enough Hashem destroyed our Beit HaMikdash. And now we're going to have to play that same kinor, the same harps that we played in the Beit HaMikdash. We're going to play it for this guy. Miyad amdu kulhem v'natlu itza. They all kind of decided together. They took a counsel with each other. V'talu kinorotem ba'aravot shayu sham, and they hung their kinorot, their harps, on the willow trees. V'shaltu b'nafshotam v'natnu elyonei yedehem l'toch pihem u'meratzatzim u'mekatzatzim motam. What they do? Well, I'm going to say they chopped off or bit off. They did something. They mutilated their thumbs in order to not have to play the kinor at that time. Where do we see this? Oh, I thought I put a slide. I don't have it. This is what David said in Nuvuah, because obviously David HaMelech was not alive at this point. It says, Al Narot Bavel Sham Yashavlu V'gam Bachinu. Right? It says, Ech Nashir Et Shir Al Admat Nechar. How will we sing our song on the land of a foreigner? It didn't mean like, "Oy, how can we sing in this land?" It meant we don't have the ability to play these kinorot. We can't play these harps because we have made ourselves a physically impossible a way to be able to do it by cutting off our thumbs. They did it. The Levim did it so that they shouldn't take that which was used in the Beit HaMikdash and use it to, quote, entertain Nebuchadnezzar and his people. That was a tremendous act to have done. One final little anecdote, when I learned this a long time ago, but I learned it again for this class, it reminded me of a story. In 1972, I had an aunt, a great aunt, my father's aunt, who came from Russia when it was the Soviet Union, and spent 5 weeks with us in Chicago. And she said that she could remember that her father, which would make it, my great-great-great-grandfather, would make kiddush like this, holding the kos, which is normal for a lot of people. I hold my kos like this also. But the reason he had to do it like this, because he couldn't hold it like this, because he had cut off his thumb. He wasn't a Levi. He didn't have a kinor, but he wanted to stay out of the Tsar's army and not get drafted for 25 years. So he cut off his thumb. This way they wouldn't take him into the army. But what the Levim did was an amazing act of courage as well. Tov. Next week, we're going to see a few more little bits and pieces of this chapter having to do with different things that you could lose and not really catch if you just read through all the names. And then we'll begin after that, Bezrat Hashem, to move on to the next chapter that goes into more of the detail of their actual journey to the land of Israel.